Hi, I'm Mark Coulson, editor of Total Kart magazine. The Chod Rig has only really become fashionable in the last couple of years, but I've seen versions of this used as long as sort of 10, 12 years ago. Essentially, it's the rig that you can cast anywhere. It's a bit like a solid PVA bag. Wherever you chuck one of these, within reason, it's going to present pretty well. So if you see a fish show, or if you're not quite sure of the nature of the lake bed, pretty safe to chuck one of these out. You know, and be relatively confident that you're presenting a bait. It's not going to tangle. It's almost impossible to tangle one of these. It will actually rotate as it flies through the air on the cast, and when it comes down, the lead hits the deck. The Chod Rig sits like that. You've got a buoyant bait which will always keep the hook link up, and it sits. You know, we've used this little bit of bark here just to demonstrate it, but on choddy bottoms, which is where the name came from, that rig is sat nice and effectively. It's never going to end up underneath the leader. I mean, it's pretty unlucky if it does. I don't think I've ever had it happen. And unlike lots of rigs, it's not going to get caught up in any detritus on the bottom. You imagine that that was much thicker, say it was thick silt or even weed. Now, I'm not condoning the use of rigs in kind of, you know, 4-6 foot weed, but if you've got a couple of foot of weed here, the key with the chod is, and again, this is a question that gets asked all the time, this top bead, which when the rig flies through the air, it comes to rest there. Okay, that top bead, you can set that at whatever distance you want. So if you want that rig to settle nearer to your lead, then you'd have the bead somewhere like so. If the detritus on the bottom is a little bit deeper and you want to get that rig further away from the lead to be absolutely sure that it's still presented, you know, that's where it's going to end up, okay? It's up to you where you set that bead, but importantly, as with any rig of a helicopter nature, it's important that this bead can come off the leader safely in the event of a mainline breakage. Now on this lead core version, it's simply a case of a small piece of either shrink tubing or silicone with a tapered bore bead on it, and you can see how easily that comes off. So in the event that that line breaks and that rig comes under any pressure whatsoever, let's say it hooks a carp but there's no line there, that will just pop straight off and come straight off the end of that leader. Okay, but minimal pressure that was, but it's still secure enough to keep that rig in place on the cast. Important, and I've seen it, and it flies in the face of the rig and its mechanics, but it's important that you never attach any kind of PVA bag or stick or anything like that to a chod. It doesn't work, and if your bead does its job properly, that will just come off on the cast. If it doesn't, then that's not a safe rig and you just don't cast it out. So another variation of the Chod Rig, which has come into fashion in the last year or so, is what's known as the naked chod. Now basically it's exactly the same presentation. I've even used the same rig here, but instead of running on a lead core leader, this is just running on a fluorocarbon mainline. Now, fluorocarbon sinks, it's invisible, and it's very much in keeping with the modern trend for slacklining. Now, one thing that you must remember if you're using the naked chod, you've still got the same setup with a boom and a bead at the bottom and then a bead at the top, which must be able to come off in the event of a breakage. But the thing to really remember is, particularly with modern pop-ups that are designed specifically for chod rig fishing, that's a very buoyant bait. Now, even with fluorocarbon, but definitely with mono, if you were to cast this out without any kind of counterbalance, there's potential for that to actually lift the main line up. Okay, now that isn't a presentation that is going to be particularly effective. So, small piece of tungsten rig putty. Now it's important that that's not bigger than you need. See too many people pile the tungsten putty on, and basically you completely, if you like, it flies in the face of how you want the rig to settle. The idea of this is you want it to land nice and gently so that anything that it does stop against, it won't crash down into like light weed or silt or anything like that. So it's just going to land nice and slowly and sit as you want the rig to sit. Now the rig putty, as I say, you only need a small piece. Where you've got your ring swivel there, the putty, it's important that it goes above where the knot is there and this top part of the swivel. If you start coating this bottom part of the swivel here, the rig itself doesn't have the rotation and the freedom of movement that it needs. So, quite chilly this morning, so I'm just going to work the putty just to soften it a little. Press the swivel onto it, like so, and then it's just a matter of moulding it around. Make sure the putty meets itself on the other side, otherwise it can come off. Now, quite a big chunk of putty that. So what I would do normally is test that in the edge. Drop it in the margin, just look to see how slowly that rig settles. And if it sinks too quickly, then I'm going to start taking some putty off it. And ideally, I just want that to land as softly as possible, but still make it to the bottom. Now it's important on that note that when that rig settles on the bottom like so, that putty, if it's correctly balanced, and the swivel should still sit upright. Too much putty and that swivel is going to land like so, okay? And it's going to actually sit down in the detritus. The ring has now been negated, that may as well not even be there, and that rig has no freedom of movement. So it's still going to work if the cart comes from this direction, but from this direction it hasn't got the freedom to swivel as it needs to. It's vital that that swivel and putty still sit in a position so that it's just proud of the lake bed. Get that wrong and you can turn an excellent rig into one that's no better than chucking out your usual pop-up. Okay, one of the things that you'll have noticed on the Chod rig is that the hook bait is actually tied on using bait floss as opposed to it being, say, pierced and having a hair pass through it. That's largely to protect the buoyancy of the bait. No matter how good your pop-ups are, as soon as you start piercing holes into them, there's going to be some water ingress, and over a period of time, that will affect the buoyancy. And the idea with the Chod rig is you want the most buoyant bait possible to keep that rig nice and proud off the bottom. A quick tip when doing this, because it can be quite fiddly, is get your pop-up and just sit it in the small hole on a spool of hook link. Basically all that's going to do is keep it nice and still for you and allow you to have two hands free to actually tie it on. Now, you know, we'll have loads of experienced anglers looking at this saying, I don't need to do that. Well, that's fair enough. But if you do struggle, then that's a great way of keeping that hook bait nice and still. Take a length of bait floss, form a large loop, okay? And then within that large loop, form a smaller loop. Okay, it can be a little bit fiddly this, but you'll get there. The tag end that you've just created that small loop with gets passed twice through that smaller loop. So you're actually trapping the small loop against the large loop. A lot of loops going on here, but it does make sense. So now you've got that big loop and a smaller loop, which you're just going to draw that smaller one down by pulling on this tag end. So that gives you, in effect, a sliding loop, okay? Sit that over your pop-up, which is nicely held in place there, and just carefully draw it down. And obviously you want that to be as central on the bait as possible. Lots of people are scared about boilies coming off when they've been tied on. And if you do it properly and get that nice and central on the bait, there shouldn't be any problem whatsoever. Just tease that down nice and tight. Now you have to be a little bit careful because if you're using a particularly soft pop-up, then you don't want to tear right through it, but I would suggest that the really soft pop-ups aren't going to be buoyant enough anyway. So a pop-up with a decent skin on it or nice firm bait generally will be the most buoyant versions, and they're going to be, you know, better for the job in hand. It's then just a matter of taking your Chod rig and where your rig ring is sitting on the D rig, pass one of these tags through and literally just tie it off a few times, 2 or 3 times with a granny knot. Get a lighter, blob the ends very, very carefully so that you don't burn any of the hook link itself, and just get it nice and neat. And that's it, job done. Now, the one thing that sometimes scares people off using chods is that they can be fiddly to tie. I mean, with practice, and I've been using them for a long time, I still find them quite tricky, but you know, you can get there. Thankfully these days, plenty of companies make ready tied versions which are probably as good as most of us could tie anyway, so I'd be more than happy using one of these. I tie my own, but I'd have every confidence using something like this. 1 or 2 companies actually do a short version and a long version of the same rig, tied with a stiff material, already curved, so you know, it's convenience in a packet.